So this video, all about social mobility. It's all about how we move from one position to another. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of classifying class positions next, but for right now, we're going to talk about social mobility sort of in a broad sense, and then we're going to talk about how we understand systems of stratification. So um, your book talks about vertical mobility, which is either going up or down a class position. You could talk about that as upward social mobility or downward social mobility. And there's a lot of sort of analysis in sociology that talks about how people act when they are pursuing upward social mobility, which is sort of a very real concern. Lots of that work is done among first generation immigrants, for example, who are coming to Canada and are looking for a better life for their children. That's a pursuit of upward social mobility. But there's also sort of some conversations about how people act when they are trying to avoid downward social mobility. This is, again, sort of something that comes in the realm of like elite sociology, in that there's a lot of discussions about how relatively wealthy parents are acting in ways to prevent their children from having quality of life that is lesser than theirs through sort of gatekeeping access to resources and stuff like that. So sort of we have concerns about both. Horizontal social mobility is essentially changing your role without changing your status. So if you remember when we were talking about socialization in Unit 4, we were talking about how you can have a similar position in the hierarchy, and nurses and teachers, for example, have very similar positions in a social hierarchy, but their roles are quite different. So an example of something like horizontal social mobility is about sort of moving from having a role as a teacher, which has sort of a position in the social hierarchy and a certain set of expectations, to being a nurse, which has a similar position in the social hierarchy, but a different set of expectations in terms of what you're expected to do, what people say about you as a result. Okay, so that's qualifying social mobility based on direction, sort of where you're moving. But when we talk about mobility in this context, there's a whole other way of classifying it, which is in relation to what, right? We can only really talk about social mobility if we choose a reference point, right? Because otherwise, all we have is this moment here in time now, and that's the sort of class position you're at in this moment in time, and we can't tell, for example, without a comparison, whether that is better or worse, or in what ways it is different. So we need a comparison. And we can do that when we talk about inter and intra-generational sort of mobility. And that's really the two sets of comparisons that we often make. So intergenerational mobility is essentially comparing your social position to other generations in your family. So practically, that often for adults means that we compare your social status, as in your status as sort of a university student or your status as a young adult establishing themselves in the world, relative to your parents' social class. Typically, that's the comparison we make when we talk about adults sort of in their later adulthood, in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. We can also make comparisons, for example, between their experiences of social class and their children's, largely because, for example, we have a set of social ideas. Again, social stratification is a very real thing, where we expect that university students are just going to have class positions and experiences that are different from their parents, right? Like no one expects you as a first year or second year student to also be earning $150,000 a year at a full-time job. That's not sort of part of our social expectations, even if your parents are earning that kind of money, right? So we have sort of those expectations. That's intergenerational social mobility. And as I said, it is about a comparison to your parents or your children or other generations in your family. Some people do this back sort of to grandparents and that kind of thing. But intra-generational social mobility is all about reference to yourself. Okay, and when we talk about that, what we're sort of meaning is, how did you grow up? What class position was your family in as you were growing up, and what class position are you in now? And that is a little bit different in that, for example, in an intergenerational sort of model, if your parents were really wealthy and then they lost everything, say in a stock market crash or whatever, and then you lived that way for a while, but then you wound up really wealthy at the end, we have no intergenerational social mobility. But if we're talking about I was really wealthy as a child, and then I had this experience of like extreme poverty in the middle, and now I'm experiencing wealth again. That can be forms of intra-generational social mobility, because you sort of have moved through that period of time, right? And it's really just a question of what you're comparing it to and what kind of time scales you're looking at, right? So those are questions of mobility. But before we get too much further into this, I want to make a bit of step back a little bit and talk a little bit about the idea of socioeconomic status, which is a term we use in sociology all the time, but the context helps you to understand it. Okay, so this isn't in your textbook, the term is, but its history isn't, and I'm going to give it to you because it often helps students make sense of what they're trying to say with that term, and why we use it sort of rather than social class. Okay, so if you've sort of been following along with conflict studies, conflict theory, you're probably pretty familiar with the idea that Marx is sort of our first major theorist to talk about social stratification. And his interest is largely in this economic sphere, in this idea about who has money and who doesn't, and what do they do with money. Okay? And that idea persists for a while, except that Weber thinks he's wrong. And Max Weber's sort of position on a lot of this stuff is that, yes, economics is important, but it's not everything. And specifically, Weber is writing in that sort of development of socioeconomic status about the position of the parish priest. And that's not super important, but his example of it is. And so when Weber talks about socioeconomic status, he's talking about power, he's talking about wealth, he's talking about status, he's talking about a bunch of different things. And the example that he draws on to sort of point out we need something more than social class here is to talk about parish priests in European villages around 1900, okay? Which, whatever, but it applies. Like the same concept about we need more than money to talk about this applies now. And he's talking about that because the parish priest in most small communities in Europe at the time would have had very little material wealth. You had lots of priestly orders that required people to take a vow of poverty. The salary of priests is not that great. They're not really expected to amass their own kind of personal fortunes. That's not part of the job. They don't usually pay for their own housing. They don't usually have a ton of control. Like, they don't start businesses. You don't really have a lot of millionaire priests. That's not a thing. But despite all of those sort of like pressures that sort of reduced economic sort of class, parish priests at the time held a whole lot of social power, right? They would get invited to dinner at everybody else's house. When something weird came up in the community or there was a decision that needed to be made, their opinion often counted for way more than their economic position should have had them do. And so they had these positions of power within the community. And so Weber's sort of talking about we need to talk about social and economic power, and we need to sort of talk about them as being intertwined. In a contemporary context, we might also talk about things like we need to talk about more than money, because there are many drug dealers who have more money than brain surgeons, but we generally listen to the brain surgeons' opinions about what we should do in the world more than we listen to the drug dealers. So that's sort of another way of looking at it. For those of you who are curious, Statistics Canada does in fact create really complicated socioeconomic status listings. So they do a bunch of stuff about, okay, well, how much trust do you have in nurses? How much do you respect these people? They do all of that work. So they create a table. It's very complicated to use. I'm not going to ask you to do that, but like ranking those professions and that sort of experience is absolutely a part of that. So when we start talking about social mobility, right, what's moving, right? And so when Weber's talking about socioeconomic status, he's talking about the possibility, essentially, and that in order to understand society, we need to understand these possibilities, that you might have the potential to change your socioeconomic status by changing either element of that. So, for example, if you run a small business and your business starts to make more money, that might increase your socioeconomic status, but you might also be able to increase your socioeconomic status for example, we have lots of people who do this, who by moving from a much more lucrative career, like a career that pays you a lot more, into politics, where you make less money but have more power. And that both of those might be an increase of socioeconomic status or a decrease, depending on sort of how you're talking about it. And that's just sort of a way of talking about the overlap of that. And education is part of that, but not all of it. And we have a lot of sort of those pieces around social capital and high culture and low culture. So, for example, we can talk about the difference in socioeconomic status if you have degrees from different universities, even if you wind up in the same job, and how people understand that. This is a really complicated question, but I wanted to sort of give you guys a background in that. Next up is systems of stratification.